Yep. So that was "Girl from the North Country." That's the duet that Bob Dylan did with Johnny Cash. And actually, during the recordings for this album, they did a number of songs together. I believe somewhere upwards of 15 or more in just one day in February. It was the last day of recording for the album, and they just plowed through a bunch of songs. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But again, this is the number 89th album on our list. It ranks number 25 in 1969, and it comes in at number 884 overall. So again, and John, you and I kind of alluded to this during one of the Cleaning the Stacks episodes, but this is, this is the number 25 album in 1969. And it kind of goes to what we were talking about, how a lot of the albums that we're hearing, that we're covering in this list, are from the latter part of the decade, particularly 1969. I think roughly a third of the albums we're covering are from that year. So 69 was busy for sure.
I noticed that as well. It seemed like all the albums. I wonder if there's some sort of late period bias on this list or something.
Yeah, we talked about that too, like with the jazz and kind of the early stuff in the 60s. But yeah, so we're going to get a lot of latter 1960s stuff here. So this is Dylan's 9th album, and it was released on April 9th, 1969, which was roughly 15 months after he released the previous album, John Wesley Harding, which is what we covered in our first episode. Actually, there was something that I read that said that Dylan, they said he was joking when he said this, but one of the original titles that he was considering was John Wesley Harding Volume 2. But he actually went with Nashville Skyline. So this album is the third of 4 albums that Dylan recorded in Nashville, and that's going to be a big theme here because when we talked, John and I, in one of those Cleaning the Stacks episodes, we talked about the Byrds and how they were really influential on country rock. Well, Dylan is probably just as much as influential, but in different ways, because he really, once he started recording in Nashville, he made that kind of the cool thing to do. And other artists like Neil Young, Leonard Cohen actually as well, people started kind of hearing about recording in Nashville and started doing that much more than they had before.
Was it much more segmented then? Like straight country acts would just go to Nashville?
Yes, yeah, definitely. It was pretty much all country artists that did that. And Dylan was, in the Byrds, who did Sweetheart of the Rodeo, some of the first rock artists or, folk rock artists, non-country artists that recorded in Nashville. So it was the beginning of that kind of that era. So the other albums he recorded Blonde on Blonde in Nashville, which I actually didn't know. And we're going to cover that much later on this list, as well as John Wesley Harding, this album, Nashville Skyline, and the album that followed this, Self-Portrait. So they recorded it in 4 sessions in February of 1969. And many of the musicians here were Nashville musicians. They affectionately referred to them as the Nashville Cats. And I think we also talked about Charlie Daniels passing away a couple weeks ago, or maybe a month ago or so. And he was a guitar player and bass player in this album. And the way he got that job was one of the guitar players that had been playing with Dylan on Blonde, Wayne Moss, actually got fired because he said he made some kind of comment to Dylan about, complaining about Dylan's writing process, because Dylan would essentially show up late to the studio and then he would spend hours writing songs, and the musicians just kind of had to hang out and wait for him to be done. So Dylan said one time, "I have to go write some lyrics," and Wayne Moss goes, "Oh, here we go again." And that kind of rubbed Dylan the wrong way, and there was probably other conversations that were had prior to that. So Dylan basically canned him, and that provided an opportunity for Charlie Daniels to come in and play in that. Charlie Daniels credits that with being a big catapult for his career. So he was always very appreciative of Dylan for that. So a lot of the sound of this is a country album, but unlike the Sweetheart of the Rodeo album that we talked about before, I think that this one definitely has more rock elements that I think John and I were talking about. Sweetheart of the Rodeo really didn't have that at all, which was kind of you know, at the time, you got to think about this. This is 1969. This is the height of the counterculture and protesting Vietnam, coming off the heels of Robert Kennedy's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination. So there was a lot of, it was a very tumultuous period. And Dylan, again, was, you know, one of the voices of that generation and was very much involved in civil rights movement and protest music earlier in the 60s. And he just decides to go do a country album, and it's very basic in its lyrical content and its musical content, and he was crossing genres, and he was again betraying people that were really in the rock field and the folk field that were you know, kind of this was not what he should be doing in their eyes. And so in that sense, it was a very important album for the progress of country rock. So so that's a little bit of the history. I have a couple of other facts here, but just kind of curious as to you guys and what your knowledge of this was going into it. Josh, why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us your sense of any familiarity with Nashville Skyline before this week?
No, I didn't know any of the songs on the album. I mean, right off the jump, I was really surprised that Johnny Cash was on there. And I really liked the upbeat kind of rocking nature of this album. It was much more fun to listen to, for lack of a better word, and accessible, I guess would be another way to say it. And yeah, I really liked, I guess what I'm trying to say too is a lot of the songs are really catchy, and and I appreciate I always appreciate a concise pop song, or, you know, in this case, country rock song, and I like that in this album.
Yeah, and you're getting that here with what 10 songs in 27 minutes. So it's,
yeah, exactly.
You know, it's another. A lot of these albums are pretty short, I think, that we're covering here. So, John, what about you?
So this probably falls in the era of Dylan that I actually was not super familiar with, and it's interesting that we covered John Wesley Harding and then this album, Nashville Skyline, because with the exception of some of, you know, Dylan's 90s and 2000s and, you know, the later work, right? Not the work that is considered the major part of the canon. I was very familiar with Dylan from the early folk roots till about right before John Wesley Harding. And then I was very familiar with his mid-70s work, especially, you know, Blood on the Tracks. So right. This album, you know, John Wesley Harding, Nashville Skyline, I think it's Self-Portrait, right? And then New Morning. Those were the 4 Dylan albums that I don't know if I ever thought I was going to get around to listening to, because, you know, you pass the moment and you're not there, right? So this was a real pleasant surprise for me because, it really seems like a gift after we did Sweetheart of the Rodeo and talked about how it was basically a country album intruding onto rock. And now here is, in my opinion, a better version of that sound. All the way down to, you know, you pluck Johnny Cash for the first song. So that's number one. Number two is, boy, it was almost jarring to hear Bob Dylan sing, and with a crooning voice as well. Actually very pleasant, to be quite honest. And so that obviously jumps out at you immediately. But the caliber of the songs on this album, the way this album sounds, and a continuation of what we talked about in the last episode, first episode of the show, I should say, with John Wesley Harding, the bass lines again are just fantastic in this. And the musicianship and the hallmarks to country are all there, like they were in the Byrds album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, but the rock elements aren't lost. And so it's just very interesting that a guy who was known as a folk artist was able to straddle the rock world a little bit better than, in my opinion, than the Byrds were, who were playing plugged in for a lot of the time. Yeah,
I don't think it's really a debate at all, right? I mean, this is way more bluesy, rocky than Sweetheart of the Rodeo. You're really struggling to find that rock element. I was anyway with Sweetheart of the Rodeo, and there's just so many elements here with the guitar playing, with the piano, that you can just tell this is much more rooted in a rock oriented fashion, but it definitely has layers of that country on there. And I think one of the reasons that's a pleasant listen, a lot of the musicians here, Dylan, the producer, who is Bob Johnston, who had produced all of the albums prior to this, from Highway 61 Revisited up until, through here, as well as some of the musicians, McCoy and Buttrey, that were on other albums with him as well. I mean, these guys have been playing for a while. They knew each other. They knew each other's styles. And so when they teamed up for this album, it was really second nature to them. And it was just ended up being a really fun recording experience for everybody. Like I said, it was done in 4 days. And even though Dylan kind of had a weird way of writing songs and, taking his time, for these guys kind of knew his style and they just let him do it. And, they came up with a really solid album that is surprising. And going back to his vocal, the sound of his voice here, it's like I think I mentioned it in the John Wesley Harding episode, that it's definitely different. It's not what you would expect Dylan to be. And I think that many people, if you've never even heard this, you'd really struggle to come up with Dylan as being the singer, I think, for some people. But he kind of attributed to that. He talked about in an interview, one of the reasons that his voice went like that was because he quit cigarettes. So I think that's probably maybe part of it. Maybe it made it easier to sound like this, but it's not like he just stopped smoking cigarettes and then 2 weeks later he sounded like this, So it was kind of an interesting, excuse that Dylan gave for that.
It could be self-mythologizing for all
yeah.
you know, too.
Dylan would do that, really?
The man of mystery.
Yeah.
So this kind of continues, though, something I notice with Dylan, which is that he, whether by design or just where his artistic vision led him, he always seems to be doing something that is not where everybody else is going. So while everybody else is going psychedelic, right, he's going into a stripped down album like John Wesley Harding that embraces folk ideas, right, but then moves them into a rock direction. He goes electric, right as the peak of folk music is hitting, and he could have continued to ride that out. And he makes a country album here, but he does it in a singing voice, right? Very different than Dylan along the way. And it's interesting that throughout the 60s, he just seemed to always be on the cusp of doing something either artistically different or just detached from even where the very trendsetter, groundbreaking groups are going. And that's one thing I have to give Bob Dylan credit for. He was just ahead of the curve throughout the 60s at all stops. And I would go so far as to say this might be my second favorite Bob Dylan album after Blood on the Tracks. I really enjoyed everything about it. For as short as it was, I thought the songs were fantastic. The voice, as much as you can joke about Bob Dylan's voice, and I have over the years, I was highly impressed by how it complemented the songs. So a strong effort, and really as much a template for what we talked about of opening Nashville and country music up to rock. And I would argue that probably this did a better job of it than even the Byrds laid the foundation, but this Dylan album, especially getting Johnny Cash to co-sign on it, I feel really moved the ball in that direction even more so. So it was a real pleasant surprise for me.
And that the inclusion of Johnny Cash was also very important on the country side of things, right? So you had really two prominent figures in their respective, genres that came together and, showed people like, hey, we can coexist, right? There are similar elements here, and there's a mutual respect here. And I think that was something that, you can look at it from more of a rock, folk perspective and a country perspective, that teaming up of the two of them was very important for both sides of the aisle. And if you're interested, if you wanted to hear more of those, recordings, because like I said, they did, this was the only one that made the record, which was Girl from the North Country, but there were a bunch of other ones, and that was on one of the, if anybody knows Dylan, in recent years, in the last 20 years, they've been releasing almost like every year, there's like a new bootleg series released from Dylan. And it's just all this, he's got so much stuff on the cutting room floor that was whether it was either live recordings or, different alternate takes of tracks. But if you're interested in that at all, he did, I think it's volume 15 called Traveling Through, which covers a lot of the different recordings that Dylan did while in Nashville in the mid and late 60s. And pretty much, I think, I don't know if all of the Cash recordings are on there, but a lot of them are, if not all of them. So I agree. I like this album a lot, and I know a lot of Dylan stuff, and I didn't really know this album that well. This was not something that was in my record collection, and I knew a couple of things, like I had heard "Girl from the North Country." That was actually redone it was originally done on the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, which was his second album. And so if you know that song, this is very different from that. It's shorter. They cut out a couple of verses, but it's a very great version. And I felt like with that song, it's almost like the two of them you could just tell that they just walked into a studio and said, okay, you take verse 1, I'll do verse 2. And then they just sang it, right? Because when they're duetting in the chorus, they're not really in step with each other. They're kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah,
and
there's
it's kind
no
of just
synchronicity in their harmonizing. And it's particularly funny after we've covered so many groups that specialized in harmony,
yes.
to hear I don't want to say they made no effort to synchronize, but yes, as Matt just said, it's jarring.
I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say, though, because it sounds like they just walked in and started singing, and they were like riffing off each other, and it sounds all over the place. But it also works. I think I didn't get turned away by that at all. So yeah, and I knew that song, and I think, like I said, I think "Lay Lady Lay" is probably the most recognizable and maybe the best song on this album. I think people talk about a lot of the lyrics, and that's the other thing I wanted to talk about was the lyrics, John, because there was a reviewer that said something about that the lyrics were, I think he said, if I was Dylan's English teacher in high school, I would make the comment on the top of his paper that Dylan is capable of better lyrics, so I don't know if what your takeaway from this was lyric-wise.
That's an interesting take, because I've always felt a criticism I have of Bob Dylan is sort of what I have about a lot of the beat poets and a lot of people writing in the 60s, is that more isn't necessarily always better. A volume of words and abstract, and we're going to get into prog rock down the road, and we're going to get into a couple of Matt's Sacred Cows as well, but I feel like the overwhelming nature of being a cipher in your lyrics sometimes is a downside for me personally. So to hear him very straightforward write songs, but unlike John Wesley Harding, where he was detached as a third person, sort of like a travel log approach, here he's singing as a character, but it's a lot more personal, and the songs are funny and kind of entertaining, like Country Pie and Peggy Day. Mm-hmm. These aren't songs you really expect from Bob Dylan. They're very straightforward. They're very direct. I can see if you like the Bob Dylan and you're imagining him as poetry, or you're imagining him as putting stuff out there that's think pieces, this might not appeal to you. But for me, it was a nice change of pace. And I give Dylan credit that he was willing to go there, because he could have just kept making albums that were borderline indecipherable, or that people read their own stuff into lyrically and ran with that. It's probably a little harsh to say indecipherable, but it just, he likes to write stuff that's abstract, and oftentimes he won't even tell you what it means, right? That's not
a little
the case.
Pretentious. Would you say it's pretentious?
No,
like
pretentious is too loaded a word. I would just say it's not really my style, but I understand why it is other people's. But this was for a 26-minute album. Which is hilarious in its own right, because it's incredible to think that Bob Dylan would have a 26-minute album of 10 tracks, right? That sounds more like it should be made by, Minor Threat than Bob Dylan, right? But I enjoyed it lyrically. It's not profound, but it's not unprofound either. And like I said, it's fun. The songs are entertaining. They get to choruses more often than Dylan does, which makes sense, because with country, you have choruses in a way that sometimes you don't in, say, folk music, or Dylan's not really jam music, but you get what I'm saying there.
Yeah. These songs are much more playful and lighthearted. I feel like, compared to some of his other songs. Sometimes I feel like Bob Dylan is so weighty, or tries to be too self-serious, even though I know he's not. But I guess maybe that's the chameleonic nature of him, that he's hard to pin down. I think that's what John was saying a little bit.
Yeah, and there was stuff that I was reading, he had said in some interviews that country music actually, when he started kind of going in this direction, he said he felt more comfortable with it because it was stuff that he kind of grew up with and always liked, but just never really explored. So, he really liked to do this. And he, like John said, that when everybody else zigged, he zagged. He kind of just wanted to do whatever he felt like doing and just always stayed true to that. And, and a lot of people just, he lost a lot of fans because of that. But I think in retrospect, you can look back and see a lot of the stuff pretty much up until this point. A lot of his stuff in the 60s was all pretty much well received in one way, shape, or form. It's really with the next album, Self Portrait, that has a lot of covers on it, and some subsequent albums after that he really starts to, I think, fade away in terms of critical acclaim. That changed a little bit with, John talked about Blood on the Tracks, and we'll talk about that when we're in the 70s. But, really his 60s output was just tremendous, and there was just a lot of changes in there. It's kind of reminiscent of the Beatles, I think, in the way that they changed their styles, they changed their look, they changed their approach in different ways for sure. But it was I think it was a calculated thing, but I also thought it was a genuine thing that he just, all right, I'm done with that. I'm moving on. Dylan is not a nostalgic kind of guy that's going to, that's going to get too caught up in what he did before. He really wants to move forward, I think.
What I've come to appreciate with Bob Dylan as I've gotten old. It's funny, I've had the reverse Dylan experience where a lot of people really love Bob Dylan when they're young. And then as they go on older, right, he doesn't grow as much. For me, he's grown on me a little bit. And that is the appeal to me of Bob Dylan, that lack of nostalgia. It's something he shares in common with some other artists from that era. John Lennon comes to mind. And I always thought with the Beatles, it's very interesting that all of them were nostalgic except for John Lennon, who was anti-nostalgic, right? And I think that's why he was so influenced by Dylan. And I think
George was a little not. I don't think he was so much in the nostalgia either. He was pretty happy moving on and doing his own thing after the Beatles. But I see what you're saying yeah, definitely.
But go ahead. I'm sorry, Josh.
No, go ahead. I have something different to say.
But I was just going to say, unlike the Beatles, who kind of went where the culture was going, I always felt like Bob Dylan didn't go where the culture was going. And that's another true. Really interesting thing. It would have been easy for him to have gone to an ashram, and maybe like at the beginning when he went to Greenwich Village, right? That was kind of a thing, but he made it a thing, right? And so even with his country album, he takes a different approach and doesn't try to go all the way in country like the Byrds did, and be viewed as inauthentic. He manages to still be Bob Dylan doing a country album. And there's something really impressive about that. And two things before I kick it to Josh. Number one, I just want to once again say the bass lines on these two albums have just really stood out for me because they do not exist in early Bob Dylan albums, but they are incredible here. So kudos to whoever's laying down those bass lines.
That's Charlie Daniels is doing a lot of the bass work.
I was going to say, it's just fantastic. And they were good on John Wesley Harding, too. But in this album in particular, they're excellent. And Deep Cut, Tell Me That It Isn't True, comes in as the 8th song on the album, and it's really worth revisiting. It's before Country Pie, which is sort of a lighthearted, like almost like a minute and 30-second song, which is fun. And shortly after Lay Lady Lay, which, like Matt said, is the most well-known. But I'd like to point out that one is a nice little gem deep in the album.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he's so prolific. There's always songs to discover with him. Did you get a sense of if this brought any country fans to like Bob Dylan or rock in general, like with the crossover appeal like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly how much effect it had. I know that I think it had some effect, but I don't imagine that a ton of, Nashville country fans really gravitated towards that. I think that fan is traditional. A country music fan likes, they know what they like and they like to kind of stay in that lane a lot of times, I think. And so I don't know if they branched out as much, but I think that maybe with the addition of Johnny Cash on the album, there might have been a little bit more respect given. Maybe there was, maybe some people gave him a little bit more of a chance, but I don't know if I would say, and this is just a gut feeling, it's not something that I read about specifically, but I wouldn't venture to say that there were a ton of country fans turning over into being Bob Dylan fans or rock fans. Well, I think that, I could be wrong about that, and somebody could email me and tell me that I'm totally full of it. But
I don't you also think that, and we've seen it over and over again with different entrees into Nashville, right? Like you can have a crossover song in Nashville, right? But you know, they're very protective. Country is as much about an image and an ideology. You know what I mean? Like coming out of the South, coming out of Nashville, the small town kid made good. So, you know, while you have breakthroughs like, you know, Shania Twain, right? Like a Canadian doing stuff. Taylor Swift flirting with it, but not all the way being there. You know what I mean? You have Bob Dylan. I think it's like you're allowed to have a song, but you're only going to be able to get so far in that establishment. You know, you're really, I think, delving into country in many ways for yourself as opposed to becoming a known country artist. It seems to me, at least from a long experience in watching those crossovers.
Yeah, that would be a whole another show or something of researching crossover country acts. And
well, you could be like Little Nas X.
The history, yeah.
But you're not are they going to accept a whole album of Little Nas X saying he's going country? I doubt it.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think maybe more of the singles, but so just a couple of things. We'll wrap up here in just a second, but I thought it was interesting that Chris Christopherson, the well-known musician and songwriter, was a janitor in the studio at the time that this was being recorded, and he's not credited with anything on the album, but he actually did hold a set of bongos and a cowbell during the recording of "Lay Lady Lay." So he lent that might have been the first couple of times that he was involved in any type of recording, but he always said that this album and Bob Dylan in particular were very influential for him in his songwriting. The other thing, this is the first Dylan album that had a completely instrumental piece in Nashville Skyline Rag, which is kind of a fun. It's a ragtime type song. It's one of those things that you feel like you're maybe walking into a saloon in the Old West, and they got the piano and people are trading off on solos and stuff.
Yep.
But you could just tell that they're having a blast just doing that. I personally, I think my favorite track on here was the closing track, "Tonight I'll Be Staying With You." Just really like everything about this. The bluesy piano part had some cool fill-ins in between, some of the verses and parts. There's slide guitar in the background, and this one is a great combination of both rock and country, and it's probably my favorite track on here. I don't think there was anything here that I disliked, like you guys have alluded to. It's a quick listen. It's very easy. It's fun. It's mostly upbeat. And it's, even if you're not a country fan, like if you really go like, I don't like strong I would not say that this is a strong country sounding album. Unlike the Byrds' Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is very country, this one is much more palatable, and I think more people could get down with this for sure.
This is also a great entree into Bob Dylan if you're not much of a fan of folk Bob Dylan, because I do. It's shorter. It's different. It's singing. I want to add too, Matt, if you don't mind. As we were talking, I was curious about the bassist for these two, or for this album, and it turns out that John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline shared the same bassist. His name is Charlie McCoy, and he was part of a group of session musicians known as the Nashville A-Team, which basically put music down behind Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings and even Elvis Presley. So the bass that I was pointing out before is actually similar. It's the same guy doing the bass in both albums.
Well, and I think they might have traded up. Charlie Daniels was doing it too. I see, but yes, that guy, McCoy, who had been with Dylan for a while, and yes, I think the band members refer to themselves as the Nashville Cats. And there was a lot more musicians on this. I think with John Wesley Harding, it was just Dylan, McCoy, Buttrey, who played drums, and there was one other person. I don't know who that was offhand, but this had many more players. But there's more instruments here, right? They needed a dobro player. That's not something that most people are versed in. There was much more organ and piano on this, so you needed more pianists and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I think. I think that's kind of what stands out, for me. Josh, did you have anything any particular tracks that you gravitated towards at all?
I like To Be Alone With You a lot. That was a really upbeat rocking tune.
Another good bass line, I think there. Yeah.
Yep. I think the Johnny Cash song is great. I think that is not just a validation to the country world, but also kind of could give this album a boost, or hey, Johnny Cash's on this album, why don't you listen to it? Sort of
He did the liner notes
thing.
too for the album.
Oh, interesting. But yeah, those are the two highlights for me.
Yeah. So I would recommend this. Like I said, I think this that's a good point, John. I think that this might be a good intro Dylan album for people that are trying to dip their toes in those waters. I always thought Blood on the Tracks was that, but I could see this being one of the ones as well. But I definitely recommend it. I like this much better than John Wesley Harding. I'm kind of slightly indifferent on that. I still like it, but I think that might be his weakest output in the 60s, but this is definitely a step up, I think. So I would give it a thumbs up.
I agree. I like this album better than John Wesley Harding, which is probably why it's higher on the list.
Yes, it makes sense. John, I assume the same for you?
Yep, I would recommend this one. It's probably my favorite Dylan album of the 60s, actually.
Wow. High recommend from John.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. Well, very good. Well, I think that wraps up the Nashville Skyline chat. So